Welcome, everybody. This is Tim McDonald coming to you with another episode of Advocacy at Work. And today I am very delighted for the first episode ever to get outside of my sphere of knowledge of advocacy in the colorectal cancer space and talk with Nora Engelbrat with the National Eczema Association. How you doing today, Nora?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Tim. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're joining us today and really excited, and have to thank Amy Niles over at Pan Foundation for connecting us. She was one of my first guests, so glad to have you here with us. Well, Nora, why don't you just tell us before we get started in too much about your role with NEA or NIA, as you refer to it as, and what your role is and what the organization does, just so we have kind of a framework of what we're going to be discussing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Eczema Association is a patient advocacy organization that represents the 31 million Americans with some form of eczema, which was a pretty startling number to me when I started. That's close to 10% of Americans have eczema or will have it at some point in their lives. And really, we kind of tried to be the resource and the hub for people with eczema, for caregivers, as well as for researchers and healthcare providers as well. And we do that in multiple ways, but trying to understand the burden of disease, but also understand the eczema community and lived experience of people with eczema as well. And so we have an advocacy program. We do great in-house research as well. We fund research, and we work with healthcare providers, and we try to create tools and materials that are based on our sort of connection to the eczema community and seeking out what they need and what best serves them to help them with their journey. So, we want to serve those with anywhere on their journey. If you have severe eczema, if you have mild eczema and just need to know which skincare products you can use that won't flare up your skin or irritate it, or if you are just starting or prescribed an expensive new treatment and want to understand how to navigate your insurance and how to actually have access to that treatment in a way that's affordable and timely for you, really the whole range. And the work I do as Associate Director for Grassroots Advocacy with NIA is really about working directly with our patient and caregiver community, finding ways to help them leverage their personal stories and share their voices to make change on a system-wide level. Primarily federal and state advocacy is what we do as well. And specifically, often that falls into three buckets. One would be raising awareness of eczema, and one would be access to care. So trying to dismantle hurdles to accessing care and treatment for eczema patients. And then the third one would be funding research, eczema research specifically.
Great. So I always like asking this question because I've never gotten the same response twice. But if I were to ask you to define advocacy when it comes to patient advocates, how would you define it? I know you just gave us the three buckets that you guys kind of use, but if you were to kind of sum up what advocacy is, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a thought-provoking question. Yeah, I mean, I see advocacy as, taking an individual and giving them a platform. So, our work is really just, it's not about me going to the Hill and, telling my story as someone who works at NIA, but it's about how can I find ways to be that sort of seat at the table for our patients and for our caregivers, to help them be able to share their story, make their voice heard in a way that can have change that's larger than just at the individual level. When it comes to access to care specifically, I think about, I talk to a lot of patient advocates in my work at NIA who they kind of, it's very easy to get into the mindset of I'm spending 5 hours a day on the phone with my insurance company and it's me against the insurance company and there's nothing I can do and I'm just, being pushed around and I don't feel like I have a voice here, and not realizing that issue that may feel like an individual issue to them is actually something that we're working on, a piece of federal or state legislation that could solve that issue, not just for them, but for everyone in their position or many people across the country. And so it's that sort of providing a voice to make change on a larger scale that I think is really important, and that education I think with eczema too, it's interesting coming into this role because eczema, I think that the raising awareness piece is really, really important in a way that I wasn't familiar with working at sort of different patient advocacy organizations, that there's kind of a knowledge gap there. If you have eczema, you understand it, you know what it means, but there is kind of a misunderstanding, I would say, about the burden of disease. So there are a lot of people who may just assume that eczema is mild. We say that, we have a campaign called More Than Just a Rash, that it's just a rash, that it'll go away, that it's a very temporary thing, that it doesn't have lasting impacts. They don't understand, the patients I work with who have sleepless nights because their itching won't stop all night, or they have to, stay in the bathtub because it's the only place they get relief, or the impact on their mental health, or for kids, being on the playground and other kids thinking that they're infectious, or that, they don't want to touch them. And, these sort of multi-level impacts that eczema can have. I think that's advocacy is really important for that, because it's about sort of amplifying that voice and being able to share, sharing lived experiences is the best way that we have to kind of help people understand who aren't directly impacted.
Yeah. So, and I know just from reading about your organization that you have an ambassador program. So, how do these ambassadors in that program help, advocates drive your mission forward with everything that you just said, what your missions were? How do the advocates kind of fit into this and help you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our ambassadors program is pretty unique from what I've seen of other patient advocacy organizations, in that it encompasses not just advocacy and advocacy activations, or what we call them, but we have 3 different tracks that kind of work simultaneously and are available to our ambassadors. So it started in 2020, so just a few years ago, and it was started, I would say, in response to looking at the work that patients who interacted with NIA and caregivers were already doing in their communities. So maybe they were tabling at local community fairs with resources about if you're newly diagnosed with eczema, here's what you need to know. Or they were doing work in their school systems or with school nurses, all of these sort of outreach activities that were happening. We wanted to see how we could make those more accessible to a larger number of people and be that sort of partner to provide those resources and expand those efforts. So we have 3 tracks. Advocacy is, of course, one. Community engagement, so things like sort of tabling, getting out in the community, is another. And then research is the third one. And I think research is a really unique ambassador track because we want to empower ambassadors, patients to really take charge of their research. I mean, as a patient advocate, I always say, like, you have to become an expert overnight in whatever your illness is, whatever your condition is. You also, I always like to say, have to become an expert in advocacy, whether or not you're participating in a formal advocacy program. You have to advocate with your doctors, with your insurance company, with your employer. So taking those skills and trying to translate them to how do you deliver this message to lawmakers, for example, or other stakeholders, I think is important. So the research angle of our ambassadors program, I think, is great because we have a research journal club every month where whether or not sometimes we have medical students who are patients who are ambassadors, and sometimes we have people who are, totally unconnected to the medical or science research world, but are personally impacted. They learn how to kind of look at new eczema research, break it down and present it to that group of their fellow ambassadors, and they just have open conversations about it, what it could mean. Eczema research is a pretty rapidly changing field right now. There's been a lot of new treatment options on the market within the past 5 to 10 years. And so I think that, being able to equip ambassadors with that research knowledge, I think also helps with the advocacy work as well, and understanding why we're asking for research funding and how to make the case for it. And then, they all kind of, I would like to think, work in harmony together, is that research, community engagement, and advocacy as well. But really, I would say our ambassadors they're volunteers, but they're also experts in their own lived experience. And they're really our go-to advocates to bring to the Hill, to provide testimony, to, talk with media as needed. And, we try to equip them with the training and the staff assistance to make that happen.
Yeah, I'm actually a research advocate as well in the colorectal cancer space. So I'm just curious, because the way you defined it is like they do talk with like other doctors and everything else. And I know you mentioned that you guys fund some research. So the research that you fund, are some of those research advocates actually like part of the trials and everything that are going on? So like I know I'm part of PCORI too, so which is the Standard Outcome Research Institute for those that don't know. But I'm just kind of curious, because I know one of their components is if you get funding from them, you need to involve the patients in the research. And so I'm just kind of curious if NIA does the same thing when you guys fund research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think research we fund, certainly, part of PCORI as well, but also research that we do in-house has a real emphasis on lived experience, like real-world data. So that is very much a part of our ambassadors program, but also just general engagement with the community. So and it's great. I think patient centricity is a fun buzzword to throw around, but it's different to walk the walk that you're talking. And I'm sure patient advocates can absolutely tell the difference. And so I think that is something that NIA takes very seriously. So when it comes to our advocacy program and our policy priorities, they're absolutely informed and selected by what we hear from the community. And I think that research partnership is a big part of that. So, for example, we recently just did a new 2025 version of a 2021 study or survey that we had done on access to prescription treatments for eczema patients data. So, like I mentioned, the landscape, if you're familiar, or if you're an eczema patient out there, that even 10 years, 15 years ago, your treatment options were very limited. Topical steroid creams and moisturizers were really the extent of the options on the market. And I think our first biologic treatment was introduced around 2017. So since then, the field has really expanded. There are a lot of great new treatments, but that also means a lot more utilization management, or a lot more, hurdles being placed in accessing care. So that treatment might be the perfect one for you, but it might be too expensive or not covered by your insurance, or you might not be able to find a specialist that can get you in order to prescribe it. A lot of different hurdles there. So being able to survey our community, our patient community, and understand on a more granular, detailed level what those issues are, I think has been really helpful to us. And especially as a smaller program, our advocacy staff is 1 to 2 depending. So we really need to make sure that we are spending our limited bandwidth on areas that are the most high impact and hard hitting for our patients. So I think that the research is really helpful for that.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of curious, was the advocacy program part of NIA since the beginning, and how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the advocacy program we've always been a patient advocacy organization, but the formal advocacy program we have started in earnest with the creation of our ambassadors program. I started at NIA a little under 3 years ago. And when I started, there was the ambassadors program, but there wasn't a digital grassroots advocacy program or platform, or at least there was the very beginnings of one. And then I was able to kind of take that and run with it. And so I think that's been a real evolution of our program because, of course, our ambassadors are really the top tier of, people who want to be engaged the most with us, who are the most invested in advocating, who will, again, like go to the Hill Days or participate in our virtual Hill Day or, level up those opportunities. But I wanted to make sure that we were building, the base of that engagement ladder, of course, and meeting people where they are. And so I think building out that digital monthly campaigns that we can do around our policy priorities, and trying to sort of gauge our audience's interest in advocacy, meet them where they're at, and then work on identifying who in that digital advocate space then is interested in stepping up to be an advocacy ambassador and working with us has been great. So I think that's been a change, a semi-recent change, and I think digital grassroots data is also just great to kind of understand more about your audience and again, like what they're engaged on. So what action alerts are performing best, and what are we getting the most traction with, what's important to our advocates, then can inform our ambassadors program as well. And as well as, of course, just having those digital touch points with legislators being really important to us too.
Yeah. So, you talk a lot about what they do. Now I'm going to ask you, like, how do you actually measure that impact that your advocacy programs have?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right?
And I don't think I've gotten an answer that is just like straight and narrow yet. So don't feel like I'm pressuring you to give me that.
I know it always feels evolving and tough. I mean, yeah, of course, the easy way to measure impact is policy change, right? And so we definitely have policy change that we can point to, and places where we can identify that our education has worked. I would say one example of that for NIA has been, if you're familiar with the peer-reviewed medical research program, it's housed within DoD. That's a program where Congress has to write a list of conditions that are included or eligible for that bucket of really great, high impact, high risk, but high reward research funding every year. But you have to show a military and service connection. And so, if you can't show that connection, but also if you're not advocating for it, they just wouldn't know to include you on the list. It's a totally one-to-one sort of if you advocate for it, you have a chance. And if you don't, and in most cases, researchers will miss out on that funding in your disease area. And, the military or service connection to eczema is one that I would say similarly is, not something that people automatically know about unless they've gone through it. And so illuminating that, doing an educational campaign around that, has led to our success with being on that list in FY25 and FY26. And now, we're measuring that impact not just by being on that list, but by, are we getting research out of that? Are we getting great new eczema research out of that? And we're seeing, eczema researchers submit strong applications and be able to fund research. So following the impact down, I think, is something that, that's an ideal case, but in other situations, Congress is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I think that, we can point out to impact or victories like that, but then we can also look at redefining what impact is or what wins are for our patients as well. So whether that's building eczema champions on the Hill, our advocates, creating strong relationships with their legislators' offices or staffers through continued contact with them and meetings with them. I also, removing policy entirely, I like to think about advocacy as a great vehicle for deepening engagement with an organization as well. So are you, does this advocate feel more empowered or more like their voice is heard? And does it lead to them participating in research or clinical trials or, other engagements with the organization that help us deepen our work too? So I think it has to be on multiple levels just because it feels sometimes harder to achieve in recent times. I always am trying to understand and engage with, how do I keep patient advocates motivated while also understanding that, reintroducing the same legislation and inching closer to passage every session can be a frustrating experience and can be something that feels harder to measure impact. So not the most straightforward answer, but it's kind of
well, I think, and I look at it because I've been on the Hill for this will be my 5th time coming up in March. And, you know, a lot of the legislative especially on the national level takes at least 5 years, probably more like 10 years to actually see an impact and change happen. So I liked how you were talking about some of the other ways that you can kind of measure it a little bit more on a monthly or quarterly basis, you know, without having to wait for those major impact wins, you know, on the federal level that take years and years to happen. And I
Yeah.
know that actually like keeping people motivated, because we've had the same ass since I started. Yeah, nothing's changed yet, really. So, but you know, just like for colorectal cancer, the screening age going from 50 to 45 took 10 years to happen, and probably about 50 different organizations coming together to make it happen. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it is achievable. But
Yeah.
persistence, I think, is a key word there.
Persistence is a keyword, absolutely. Especially, you know, the life cycle of Congress, and, you know, hitting that sort of lame duck session, hoping that things will kind of finally pull through. And then if they don't, then, you know, we're back to needing to reintroduce these bills. And sort of, I think that too is an educational piece where, you know, I've had advocates say, all of that was for nothing. We have to start again from scratch. And I say, no, the momentum that you built is still there. Those relationships that you built are still there. We're not starting from scratch, but we do have to reintroduce these. And that 5 to 10 years and feels more like 10 years recently is the real deal. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break from the serious advocacy questions and get to know you a little bit better. I just have a series of a few questions that have nothing to do with what you do for work. So don't put too much thought into them. Just give me the first thing that comes off your top of your head. So if you're ready, I'm ready with the first one. So
Sounds good.
what's your favorite color?
Ooh, my favorite color is orange.
All right. One of my high school colors. What is your favorite band or musician?
Ooh, band or musician. I love an indie folk artist called Sufjan Stevens. I'm not sure if you are familiar, but he's really great.
I am not, but I am going to definitely check it out after this. So,
Yeah. Very, yeah, he does state-based albums. So he has one about Illinois and one about Michigan, and they're very beautiful, have some interesting facts about state history as well, which is fun.
oh, very cool. I'm definitely curious about that now. So, and what is one place that you've always wanted to visit but haven't yet?
Ooh, that's a good question. Let's see. I think I would say, I don't know, I've had a couple of friends recently visit Portugal, and it sounds beautiful. I'm a big ocean and beach person, and I also have gotten into tinned fish recently, and I've heard that it's good over there, that the food is great. So that's definitely one on my list that I would love to make it over there at some point. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, my wife and I are thinking about, we already have a European trip planned. We just haven't decided where we're going outside of London yet. So, but Lisbon is definitely one of the places that we were thinking about. So,
Looks beautiful.
and what is one thing that most people don't know about you?
Ooh, that's a good question. I used to host a film club if anyone's familiar with the Alamo Draft House in DC on Bryant Street. I'm a big film buff, so in exchange for unlimited free movies, I used to host a film club there and just kind of break down different films each week, which was very fun. So yeah, that they still host the film club. So I always say, if you're interested, they pick some interesting choices, like sort of cult classics and films forgotten to time. So that's a fun fact about me.
I love it. I love it. So just to close up here, you know, and it's kind of it's a big question, because what is one big thing, if resources were no issue at all, that you would like to do to expand your advocacy program?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is, we are a small team, and so our reach by necessity has to be small. And what that means practically is, virtual opportunities, which I think are always great and have a place because of accessibility, right? Not everyone will be able to travel or want to for a variety of reasons, but I do hear a lot from our ambassadors that we work with that they would love sort of local or regional infrastructure or events. So if resources were no object, having regional hubs for NIA, or beyond that, state hubs one day, I think would help us on multiple levels. It would allow us to grow and deepen our engagement with ambassadors who are looking for in-person events, but it would also allow us to invest more into in-district and in-state advocacy, which I think is increasingly more important. As the Hill gets busier and busier, relying on local and district offices, building relationships with those offices, I think can be strategically very important over time to getting things done. And it's hard to coordinate from just from where I sit versus, being able to have state advocacy days as well for state legislatures and really build out those programs, I think would be really useful to our end goals with policy, but also to the interests of our ambassadors and what kind of brings them to NIA and gets them excited. So.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, Nora. Just before we go and sign off, how can people find out more about NIA and get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about your ambassador program?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find out more about our ambassador program on ambassadors.nationaleczema.org. So you can learn about sort of our opportunities. If you yourself have eczema, or if you have a loved one or a caregiver of someone with eczema, or if you're a dermatologist and allergist, treat patients with eczema, highly recommend that you check us out and kind of discover the resources that we have to offer. And we would love to have you as part of our ambassadors program.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much again, Nora, for joining us today. And if you're listening, you're probably about a week away from the launch of my book, From Patient to Advocate. So just visit advocacyatwork.com. You can learn more about that after you're done watching the podcast. And I would really appreciate it if you did buy it and enjoyed it, if you left an Amazon review for it. So thank you so much for watching today. And thank you again, Nora.
Thank you.